And welcome to our community. Susie Thomas with you this morning, visiting with Tammy Mackey-Schramm from Zoar Village with lots of fun things happening this weekend. So tell us a little bit, first of all, Tammy, a little bit about Zoar itself before we get into all of the big events taking place.
All right. Zoar was founded in 1817. So next year is actually the bicentennial year for Zoar Village. It was founded by a group of German separatists who came to America in search of religious freedom. They'd been persecuted in Germany for their religious beliefs. They were considered pietist, which was kind of an extreme faction of Lutheran.
Okay. And yet separatists, because we don't think of the Lutheran denomination as particularly being separatists, but these would be, in fact, I think of them as breaking away from the Catholic Church and starting that with Martin Luther and so forth. So tell us more about these people. I'm interested in them.
What they believed and kind of where they separated themselves from others was the fact that they believed in absolutely no idols, no leaders. They were even jailed for a time in Germany for their beliefs, and a couple of them were brought before Napoleon, and they refused to bow. So it went to that extreme where, not even kings or anybody they would recognize. Their playing cards, once they decided they were going to start using playing cards again, had no face cards. So it was really kind of absolutely no idols. They didn't want a leader. So that's kind of where they were separate from the Lutheran Church.
So how interesting in setting up their own community then. There was no leader? They had no mayor of Zoar? Or how did that work?
They actually founded 1817, and then 1819, they decided as a group, since money was tight, that they were going to operate as a communal settlement. So they had a group of trustees or village leaders, and they made all the decisions for the entire group.
So that's interesting. So now, in setting up their own community, now they need to set up some village leaders.
Correct, yes.
That they need to let spend all their money for them. Did they find any problem with that? I guess not.
I guess not. And then no one had too much power. They sort of, in a way, you hear Joseph Beimiller quite a lot, his name in Zoar. But I think he was kind of unofficial leader and seen as kind of, one of the figures in town because he was the doctor. He did all the sermons. He was kind of the unofficial glue that held the community together. So he's the only thing that kind of even came close to being a leader. But still, if it was time to make a decision, he would go and he and the whole group of trustees would make a decision, never him himself.
So interesting. Did women serve in any of these positions as far as decision making, or was it mostly a patriarchal society that they set up?
No, women were actually very involved, and Zoar was very equal, especially for back then. When they came in 1817, women outnumbered the men about 2-1. So they kind of didn't have a choice, really, to let them. But women voted in all the decisions, and before they came to America, they followed a woman leader, kind of a mystic that they believed in her prophecies.
Oh, wow. Tell us a little bit about the village itself. Now, it really only stretches for a few streets, I'm thinking, of Zoar proper, or maybe it's larger than I'm thinking. Maybe I'm really thinking about what you drive through and see very prominently on the street, the main street. Were these people, did they take up a lot of room, or did they settle in other places in Ohio as well, or is Zoar it?
For the separatists, you get a few relatives here and there outside of Zoar, and what you see now is just a fraction of what the community used to be.
Okay.
Now it's a few blocks, little tiny village.
Yes.
But if anyone's familiar with the area down there, their land stretched almost to Bolivar, just all the way around, and then almost out to Zoarville, and almost all the way down to Dover, too.
Oh.
So they really had a huge amount of land that
Were
they
they farmers? What did they do?
You name it, they did it. They had farming. They had all sorts of different mills. They did furniture making. They did bread and different baked goods. They had a huge dairy barn. They even had a hothouse that people would send their plants down the canal to be stored in the hothouse for the winter time at Zoar. They had a hotel, a couple different hotels. I mean, silk, you name it, industry, and they were involved in it.
Wow. Now, you're talking about pre-Revolutionary War, right? What year did you say?
1817.
Oh,
So
1817.
pre-Civil War.
But pre-Civil War, and fairly soon after the Revolutionary War.
Right, not too long. And Ohio had just become a state about 14 years earlier.
Yeah, so how do we know what we know about them?
Joseph Weidmiller, he kept a diary, and a lot of them in town kept diaries. And then it was a very, you had to join the Separatists to become a member of the community. So a lot of them, it's a pretty tight community, so a lot of oral tradition, a lot of oral stories have been passed down.
And it seems like they did everything for themselves, hence the term separatists, that
Right.
they did not interact with any communities around them.
You couldn't move to Zor unless you were a member of the Separatists and you joined their church. But if you were someone from Bolivar or Dover and you needed your wagon repaired, then they would, repair the wagon, or you could buy their milk, you could buy their products, but you weren't just welcomed into the community. They would sell to you, but you had to join the church in order to become a part of Zor.
Were they very much into simple living, simplistic, or coming from Germany, did they have a little more... I'm trying to get an idea of the architecture and the kinds of furniture and clothing and so forth. What were they like?
It's really hard to describe. It's not nearly as plain as the Amish, but then for the time, especially later when you're getting towards like the 1890s when, Victorian women had all of the frills possible, they stayed really simpler. They weren't simple, but it was simpler. And what they did, since it was communal, if a bolt of fabric came in, all the women got dresses out of that bolt of fabric.
So everybody had the same dress.
Yes, everyone was
How
kind of matching. I know.
Okay.
But today it would be. Yeah. But for them, just kind of more simple, I guess more industrious. Since everyone was working all the time, it had to be practical clothing. And they were known for their huge straw hats. But that was typical if you were working out in the fields all day.
What was it like to be a child in Zor, growing up in Zor? Did you work early in life and help out as well? Did they get play? Was there any recreation?
I think they were able to play. I think it was harder for children in general back then, and they worked a lot earlier than what we would have children working today. So it wasn't any more unusual than for the time. The children would probably start working about 10, 11, 12, but they had the boys made baskets, or the boys helped in the garden with planting and weeding. A lot of times the girls were in the dairy and did some stuff as what we would call a dairy maid. So.
Let's talk about that garden. Now, that's very much about who these people are. Let's talk about that.
It is. The garden is right in the center of town now, and it was always historically the center of town. And it was one of the only things in town that was pure pleasure. They called it the pleasure garden or the lust garden, but not lust in like kind of a sinful way. Just, I guess it was sinful because it was just pure pleasure. There was no vegetables. It was just pretty. And that was, everything else had industry to it. It had purpose to it. And that was just pleasure. And even right now, it is just gorgeous. And you feel like you're just completely lost in the garden. And the way it's set up, it's based on New Jerusalem, as portrayed in the book of Revelations. And there is one tall tree in the center, which represents Christ. There's 12 trees around the center tree in a circle, which represent the 12 apostles. And then there's all these different paths leading away. Now, there are a couple straight paths that if you follow that straight path, you go right to the center. So you'd go right to Christ.
Well, that makes sense.
Yes. And then there's other ones where, you kind of go over this way and you go that way and you'll end up in the middle eventually. But it's easier to go that straight and narrow path.
Oh, that's like a sermon right there, isn't it? Wow.
So the whole thing it's set up to be kind of, it's like a visual sermon.
And just beautiful. Tell us, what kinds of foliage do we find there?
I was amazed the hibiscus are blooming right now, and like the flowers are as big as your head. I'm not very good with plants, but I know the hibiscus are out there. There's some lavender, which is really pretty. There's some really tall, I think they're cone flowers. Like, I'm terrible with plants, but I know it's beautiful and it's pretty. And there's whites and there's purples and there's pinks and there's evergreens. And we do have some vegetables there now, but the way they're set, I know the way they're set up, it's really pretty and really adds to it.
Is Zor something that's been reconstructed, or are we looking at all of the original buildings and the original garden? I know those aren't the original plants, even if they were perennials. Somebody had to go in and rip it out and start it over again at some point. But how close to original are we when we visit Zor?
I'd say you're at least 80%. The tin shop, wagon shop, blacksmith shop, and the garden house have been recreated, but that's pretty much it.
And based on what? What did you have to be able to recreate it? Did they have written down plans of how they had laid out the village?
They used old photographs, and then a lot of them, the foundation stones were still there, or the basements, you could see where it had been. So that's how they recreated what they had.
Let's talk about the church. Did schooling take place in a separate schoolhouse? Was church the center of life? How did that all work together?
The school was separate, and church really was the center of life. On Sundays, they had 2 services. You were expected to go to both unless you had a task or a duty for that day. And then if you were making dinner, like for the evening for everyone, you could skip the morning for preparation, but then you had to go to the evening service and eat your dinner later.
Or what?
It was just expected of you to go.
Okay.
I'm sure you just were shamed or something.
Yeah.
But the way it was set up too, men and women entered separate doors, and they sat on separate sides, kind of like what the Quakers would have done.
That's what I wondered.
So yeah.
And yet, women were very much a part of the worship service as well?
Absolutely. Women were a big part of all life in Zor. Joseph Beimiller usually did the sermons, but yeah, they were involved in the church. They could play the organ. Like I said, Joseph kind of came up with everything, but yeah, they were very much participatory. They didn't have to sit there and just be quiet.
And give us a little bit of a tour. You mentioned like a tin shop and so forth. I think there's more to Zor than meets the eye. So take us around maybe in our closing minute or two in this first segment and tell us a little bit about what we will see when we visit Zor.
We have our town hall, which has a kind of canal museum and Zor Life museum inside of it. The blacksmith shop, which is going on Saturdays usually. The wagon shop. The dairy and the spring house, which is spring house is one of my favorite buildings. It's really neat. It has a lot of components to it that you never think about. And then there's the number 1 house, which kind of was the huge administration buildings. They called it the King's Palace. The Beimiller, which is under restoration right now. The sewing house, the bakery where we do some of the baking and the baked goods are in there. The garden house with its attached greenhouse or hothouse. The schoolhouse. We do not operate the church, but there are certain times where you can visit the church because it is still
it's an active church.
It's an active church, yes. Try to make sure I don't forget anybody.
What denomination is in there now? Same one?
No, it's separate. It's the Zor United Church of Christ.
Mm-hmm. And before we leave the schoolhouse, tell me about a child's education in that day. How far did that go? It was a 1-room schoolhouse, I'm guessing, and education at that time was what? To what grade?
They probably went about 8th grade, just like everyone else. It was a 1-room schoolhouse. Probably someone that was in the community was a teacher. I don't think they would have brought in an outside teacher. But the boys and the girls would have been schooled together, and it would have been kind of more like the Montessori with the 1-room schoolhouse. It would have been based on your learning ability and not, what a grade level would have been. But yeah, they probably went up to 8th grade, and then it was usually time anyway in life to go on to your career at that point.
Right. Now, I'm thinking of Joseph. Tell me his last name again.
Beimiller. Mm-hmm.
If he was the doctor, pastor, kind of if there was a leader, he was it, although a servant leader. Did they make plans for someone to replace him once he passed? What would happen next? And
they
especially
did not
if nobody was able to come in and take his place.
Yeah, they did not really kind of think of it. And he died in the 1850s. And then you kind of see Zor really flourished up until that point, and they still did really well, but you start to see kind of the cracks in the facade then, and they start to maybe we should do this. And things start to really kind of change. And by the time you reach 1898, that's when they dissolve.
Wow, so interesting. All right, we're visiting with Tammy Mackey Schrum from Zoar Village. Lots more to talk about. Stay with us. You're listening to Our Community.